For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Todd with something we're super excited about. We've got Lynn Calder with us today. She's the CEO of INEOS Automotive, but you may know it more recently as the Grenadier CEO. She'll talk about the auto company. She'll talk about it in the context of being a part of INEOS and talk about it in the context of today's energy, automotive, regulatory, and energy transition world. We're all super excited. Lynn, thank you so much for joining us. This is fantastic.
Oh, thanks very much for having me, Maynard. It's really nice to talk to you today. And I hear you've managed to get in a Grenadier recently.
I have. My neighbor, if you're watching this, I really like your vehicle, and I'm going to visit the dealership this weekend. So you're in trouble with my wife. You're encouraging me to be out in the car market. It's a really fantastic vehicle, a lot of fun. Well, before we jump in with Lynn, Mike, anything you would add about the markets? There's always something going on.
Yeah, Maynard. This week is most people were expecting an uneventful, pretty calm week, and it's been anything but uneventful and calm. You've seen bond yields plunge. You've seen commodities, crude oil plunge. You've seen the Mexican stock market plunge with the new president coming in there. So, let's talk a little bit about all three of those and maybe some other areas. First thing on the economic front, we mentioned the 10-year bond yield is around 4.3%. That's down from about 4.6%. So that's a big plunge in 1 week. And it's because economic data, the JOLTS job openings report today came in a little bit weaker than expected. You had the ISM manufacturing index yesterday coming a little bit worse than expected. So you're seeing economic stats, printing lower than expected, which is refueling expectation that the Fed is going to lower interest rates this year. As you recall, a month ago, that was exactly the opposite. And so that's where the bond market is at this point. From a crude oil standpoint, you've seen crude oil plunge by about $6 to $7 over the last 5 trading days. And a lot of that was just because of what happened at the OPEC meeting over the weekend. At the OPEC meeting, OPEC pretty much put out a statement that they're looking to bring barrels back into a market under certain circumstances, but that could start as early as October. And I think the way markets were set up to this point in time is there was a little bit of pressure on crude oil, and that was because concerns are starting to develop on the demand side. We just talked about interest rates. We started talking about, economic stats are printing worse than expected. So the market's really focused on, demand in 2024. And now the market has to worry about what does supply look like in 2024 with OPEC cuts. With OPEC bringing production back online. I would say it's a huge overreaction. Nonetheless, the market wasn't expecting it. And you've had this positive carry because we've been in huge backwardation in crude oil markets. That's all but evaporated. And so you have CTAs are really pressing on their selling contracts right now. And so we think it's an overreaction, but that's what's affecting the crude oil markets. I'd say from an equity standpoint, the good news is that even though crude oil has gone down quite a bit here over the last week, the energy equities are actually performing better than expected. They're only down 3.5%, 4%, while crude oil is down 10%. And so I think the market realizes the crude markets are overreacting. The kind of last thing we really wanted to talk about here is, with our guest Lynn on today, we want to really kind of touch a little bit on the automotive stocks. And what we'd say is, we want to kind of compare, what's been going on in the EV stocks and the ICE stocks, traditional auto companies over the year-to-date performance. And what you've seen is a huge decoupling. You've seen the EV companies, and that's like Rivian, Lucid, Fisker, Tesla. They're down on average around 30 to 35% this year. The big 3 auto companies, including GM and Ford, are up about 10%. And the reason we're seeing a big disparity is a couple reasons. One, I think, is that the U.S. auto companies have been losing a lot of money on their EV vehicles. They're starting to pull back on that. They're starting to tack more towards hybrid vehicles. And in fact, they're doing really well. And the last thing is they're going after profitability as opposed to just pushing as much EVs out there as possible. And so that profitability plus share buybacks, those ICE stocks are outperforming EV stocks. So we look forward to seeing and hearing what Lynn has to say today on the automotive industry, and we'll hand it back to you, Maynard.
Awesome. Todd, quick stop with you. Anything you'd share before we jump in with Lynn?
Well, thanks, Maynard. And yeah, following along on the last comment that Mike made, I was kind of curious about the Grenadier and what INEOS is trying to do, and how, the markets in the US and Europe are different when it comes to automobiles. So I started within the US. We sold about 15.5 million vehicles last year. Of those, about 12 million were SUVs and trucks, so something like 80%. And then you got 3 million cars. And then of the cars, about 1.4 million of those were EVs. And so the SUVs and trucks to EV ratio is, almost 10-1. And when you look at the top 10 selling vehicles in the US, 9 of them are trucks and SUVs, and only one of them is not. That's the Toyota Camry. On the other hand, in Europe, and remember, INEOS is headquartered in the UK, the story is a little bit different. SUVs did kind of hit a milestone last year of being just over half of all new vehicles sold at about 6.6 million. But there were also 2.9 million EVs sold last year in the UK and EU combined. So you're saying that same ratio I talked about, it was 10-1 in the US, and in Europe, it's only about 2-1. So I do think it's interesting that INEOS has observed that, boy, there's a market here that is maybe a little underserved, and we're going to go try to fill that. And so I think it'll be interesting to hear the story of what they're doing and where they're going from here. Back to you, Maynard.
All right, great. That's perfect. Well, Lynn, we're so nice. It's so great that we have connected. And maybe just as one really interesting thing about your background, you have you have some energy experience. You were at Talisman for a long time. You were at Lime Rock. I think that's where we first met you. And then you joined INEOS and were working, most recently, I think you were the CEO of the Composites business before you took over the automotive business. So you have energy heritage that we can talk about today, but we're just delighted to spend some time with you and hear what it is like to start an automotive company from scratch. That has to be on the list of challenging things to do. That is a big one.
Absolutely. So thanks for the great introduction. And yes, bulk of my career spent in energy. So I used to think that kind of oil and gas flowed through my veins. But yeah, in the last 7-8 years, things have changed somewhat. And I've kind of moved progressively downstream to now being right at the interface with the customer of the Grenadier. And I mean, for those that don't know what the Grenadier is, we've kind of built a pure blood 4x4. Certainly in Europe, most of the SUVs have been very much moving towards the kind of luxury, more automated, more electronic segment. And what we wanted to bring to market was that pure blood, mechanical, massively off-road capable, nothing you can't do with it, nowhere you can't go. You can fix it in the wild, but with a sense of modern comfort and refinement and quite cool, we think, British design. So, and in terms of starting that from scratch, man, it has been a ride. I think the learning experience that myself and INEOS has been through to actually really learn how to design a car, learn how to engineer it, all in conjunction with some great partners, of course, learn how to manufacture it and acquire the capability, acquire the factory to manufacture it. Now, all the way through to sales and marketing, the distribution model, how to bring it to market. And for the first time, really, for INEOS, having to really deal with a direct consumer model. INEOS's rich history in petrochemical manufacturing mainly has been business to business and hasn't really had to think about how it markets a brand historically. So yeah, we are in step, myself and INEOS, going through a pretty interesting journey at the moment with INEOS Automotive.
One thing I was struck by, you see it in some energy strategies where people have done really well, which is while the world was all going one direction, there was a few people going the other, and those people really did well. And sometimes they were buying old plants, old power plants. Sometimes they were buying oil and gas properties. In your case, as you said, you're creating a vehicle which is mechanical and rugged and internal combustion, and it is for off-road, and it is unapologetic about its direction when the rest of the world is going in a different direction. It just struck me that this is another one of those examples where you're not going with the flow, and it could be incredibly successful because this is not what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, we very much hope that it will be successful, and we certainly are extremely proud of the product that we've created. And I think, yeah, I mean, the whole world, I mean, we'll certainly get on to talking about powertrain and you know, what everyone's choosing for the future for mobility, and how that's being regulated. But even just the driver experience, we've kind of gone in a different direction. When everything else, as I said, is becoming much more automated, it's kind of sedating the driver. It's taking the driving experience out of driving. And I think there are still a whole heap of people out there around the world, myself very much included, for whom driving is a really special experience. You know, for me, it was freedom. It was getting out and seeing things. And lots of people still really like that feeling of driving a vehicle. Whereas, as you say, the entire market is really moving towards sedating that. So I think that's the fun part of going in a different direction.
I was in some of the articles we were reading about you and the company before today, that there was a great story about you personally, where your dad just loved trucks and vehicles. And at the dinner table, it was a constant conversation about all these automotive things. And you even said in his personal belongings, he had all these photo albums of pictures of cars and things like that. So it sounds like this must be a fun thing for you personally, given some of that history you have.
Yeah, my dad was absolutely car nuts. I don't think we had a car for longer than a year. He had zero brand loyalty.
I like him already. I mean, what a fantastic guy.
Zero brand loyalty. All he wanted to do was just sort of, you know, test the new thing or the old thing. You know, he just wanted to kind of know everything about every car, really. So, yeah, a huge part of my DNA. And, you know, I really wish that I'd paid a little bit more attention.
Well, one thing as we turn to the car that's striking, as we've been learning about it and thinking about it, is the car. You really, as you mentioned, this was Sir Jim Ratcliffe's sort of vision that you could create this type of vehicle. So it has a British-inspired sort of Defender-like spirit to it. But then the engine is from BMW. Some of the design was from Austria. You're building it in France. You're sort of taking the best of a lot of things as you try to weave together the product. Do you want to talk about what it's like to manage all that and to bring it together in a way to deliver the car?
Yeah, and it's kind of a nice way to kind of segue into the kind of the story of it as well, because you know, Jim, he really looked at it almost 7 years ago now as a real gap in the market, as I've said, for that kind of pure blood off-roader. And that was really with, as you say, the old Defender, saying that they were going to pull that car and not manufacture it anymore. And I think that Jim really saw an opportunity to build a car, which was an immense challenge, something that really interested him. But also a gap in the market. You know, it is a business play as well. This is something that is going the other way, as you've already said, and you know that creates opportunity from a business perspective. And you know, INEOS, its heritage in predominantly petrochemicals, moving further into energy as time went on, was very much buying unloved assets and making them profitable. And I think we have done that historically through a mix of very strong European and US engineering capability, along with, you know, British kind of commercial and, you know, in this case, design. And I think that, he wanted to bring some of that into automotive as well. So German engineering in automotive is, you know, highly respected. So, you know, let's focus on getting the best engineers, the best people that know how to build a car. And you know, we worked with BMW, as you've mentioned. You know, our transmission is ZF. We worked really strongly with Magna Steyr as development partners in the engineering of the vehicle. So really choosing that real kind of, German, Austrian engineering with lots and lots of experience in creating off-road vehicles in particular. And then, as you say, coupling that with the sort of British sort of mindset, the INEOS mindset. We're a British company, but the mindset is very much, there's nothing you can't do. Don't tell me it's impossible. We'll find a way. And just doggedly going after the business aspect of it as well. Let's make it a huge success. And then you kind of brought the French aspect into, we 3 years ago acquired a manufacturing facility in France, but it was a former Mercedes-Benz facility that had been manufacturing Mercedes and smart cars there for 20 years. So, we actually acquired quite a lot of automotive experience with that acquisition as well. So pulling that all together hasn't actually been the challenge, to answer your question. The challenges are myriad. We've got so many challenges, many of which are a great deal of fun, some of which are less so. But yeah, pulling all of that together has actually been quite organic and worked quite well.
The other thing, so we mentioned this trend, as you said, buying unloved things and making them profitable, or, sort of going in the direction that other people aren't going in. And the other one that we're very struck by is, we spend a lot of time around public companies and private companies. And INEOS is obviously an extremely large private company doing a lot of things. Do you notice any particular advantages about being private? I mean, you've said already you're not building INEOS Automotive to take it public. That's not how INEOS thinks. You are building a car company as a private company for the purpose of making money. I'm just curious about the private structure and how it helps you do what you need to do to build a great product.
I think it helps a lot, Maynard, because INEOS is kind of unique. It's unique in a few different ways, but certainly it's unusual to have such a large group, because it is a very large group now across, so many different interests: chemicals, energy, automotive, fashion, sport, and the list goes on. And to have such a large company that is still just owned by 3 individuals is pretty unusual. And what that does for me in running my business is the pace that we can run at is immense, because we're just have the agility that comes around from having no bureaucracy, no layers of management to go through. If we need a decision that's beyond my delegated authority, it's as simple as going to the 3 owners, and they will make a decision like that. So we can move really, really fast. I think that's one key advantage. I think another is that we don't have to be enslaved to markets. And I think that does sometimes happen when you start to get into that sort of, quarterly treadmill of results and reporting and what the market likes and what the market doesn't. It allows us just to kind of be very focused on running the business with the right business fundamentals driven by the right things, and not having to really worry about those external factors. And then the third advantage I'd probably raise, and I'm sure there are many more, is just the fact that we can be extremely outspoken, unapologetically, again, without kind of people, having people will have an opinion, of course, but it doesn't sort of crash our share price or increase our share price. And it allows us to say, even in automotive, as a new player, where there's a lot going on right now in the regulatory landscape in particular, where, I think we see some of our peers, some of the much larger OEMs have that enslavement a little bit with, what they can and can't say. And we can just be refreshingly direct and honest.
That's really, as you went through that, Lynn, honestly, as many times as we've thought about that question and public-private distortions, you brought out some stuff that was fantastic, including just like the distraction of your mind and your time and your energies, and the fact that when you're public, it's harder to speak frankly. And how can that be good for business? That was really awesome. Well, look, one more for me, and Mike, we got to jump in here, because I think you're while we're on this public-private conversation. We had Dan Yergin on one time, and we were talking about, what it is like in the boardroom of any company that is connected to today's energy world, and automotive and mobility would definitely be that. And what it is like to try to make decisions based on the long term when you have governments that have very strong opinions about what they want consumers and businesses to do, but yet that may or may not be the right choices or the choices that those consumers want. What do you notice? Because you see all these regulatory environments, you see all these governments, you see all these rules, you see people talking about what people want. What do you make of where this is headed in terms of consumer choice versus government preference in automotive? I know this is like a huge question, but what would you tell us about that? Do you see any changes happening?
Gosh, it's all changed at the moment. There's, we're in such a straight state of flux, and having seen that, even within my time at INEOS, in chemicals and energy, all heavily regulated industries that all are going through quite a lot of change as we kind of work towards, carbon neutrality globally, or certainly in the big developed economies. I'd say automotive is even worse. It's such a difficult time to have entered the automotive arena. And, it's difficult for those that have been around for 100 years, I think, for, really extremely well-established companies that have seen a lot of change over the years. And the level of change we're seeing now is unprecedented, I think, since the inception of the industry. We have some advantages coming into that because we're coming in with a fresh perspective. We don't have layers of change management to go through, but nonetheless, it's extremely difficult. And it's extremely difficult because, governments are really keenly aware of where we need to get to from a net zero perspective. And they think that, talking about that and pushing that agenda forward is typically vote winning. That's kind of where it has been, certainly in Europe, less so in the US. And I think what they're recognizing now is that this is not just about what they think should happen, what they want to happen, that, there's a driver in the middle of all this. I'm talking about the person actually sat behind the steering wheel. And they've been completely left behind in most of the conversations that have been happening in Europe, in particular, and in the UK in particular. And it's really kind of interesting to see how it all plays out in Australia, in South Africa, in the US. It's all a little bit different. But I'd say all markets are recognizing now, today, that there's no one solution to this problem. The fact that we need to move away from combustion engines to another powertrain solution. And governments have wanted to quite simplistically state, there's one solution here, it's electrification, here's your deadline, go. And I think what we're seeing now in a great many of those markets that I've talked about is drivers saying, doesn't work for me. So, we've been talking for, a couple of years now about the fact that there will need to be multiple solutions. The same way that in the energy transition, we're not going to transition from fossil fuels to just wind globally. There needs to be multiple technologies. And I think government stating what the solution is not particularly helpful. Actually, I think we need governments to regulate where we need to get to, but let us innovate, because I think the industry has historically been very good at that.
Well, you're touching on something that it's been hitting our radar that's just very interesting, which is consumer choice is sort of a cousin of freedom. Like there's some philosophical issues in there that are quite interesting, but you just articulated them really well. Mike, let me let you jump in here, of course.
Yeah. One of the buzzwords I heard earlier that just really kind of caught my attention was the word profit. You're not in this to basically be cool or save the world. You want to make a profit. And it feels like a lot of these EV companies, even, sort of Detroit has gone down the road of profits being secondary, other stuff being primary, and that seems to be changing. So that's fantastic. Maybe we haven't talked about it yet, but how many vehicles are you guys looking to produce on a yearly basis? Just give us an idea of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so by the end of this year, we should be with sort of 2 full shift operations in France. We'll be up at about 30,000 Grenadiers a year. I think we've made some other announcements. We've got a pickup truck called the Quartermaster coming that will be produced on the same line. And we've announced we have announced an electric platform called the Fusilier, which is coming in 2027. Which has got a bit of nuance to it, in that we're building a range extender electric vehicle. So back to the point I was just making, we don't think electric is for everyone. Range anxiety is real, particularly in larger countries like the US, where people are traveling really long distances and the infrastructure isn't there to support it. So what we've kind of come up with is it's an electric vehicle in that there's nothing powering the wheels except the electric drive unit. But we've got a small combustion engine in the front, which is recharging the battery. And that means that you can either plug it in and recharge it, or you can refuel via the fuel tank with gas, the engine that is powering the battery. And we think that's a great transition technology that currently would be banned in a great many countries in 2035 as a hybrid. But we think it's an electric vehicle with, 0% range anxiety and about 20% of the emissions of a combustion engine car. So to kind of add all of those models up, we're going to get to, in time, by the end of the decade, I guess, to a couple of 100,000 vehicles a year, not 1 million vehicles a year. So we're not looking to hit the high volume market. We're hitting, still a pretty niche market. But that's the business plan.
Hey, Lynn, I'll jump in with a quick one. Maynard mentioned this in the intro, but you've spent most of your time, or I guess all of your career, in kind of B2B environments. You're making commodities, you're developing chemicals. What's been the biggest surprise to you as you've really gotten into this automotive world where as you mentioned, you're selling to real people? You have to decide what are they going to want. You have to decide, how do I market this? How do I price it? Like, has there been something where you've been like, wow, I never would have thought of that until I got into this? Or has it just been, all new, all exciting, all frustrating? Just talk about that a little bit. Most of us are kind of more in your former world, right? I mean, we haven't had to sell things to consumers. I know I haven't. So maybe talk about that a little bit. I'm curious about how you found that.
Yeah, have there been any surprises? Lots, to be honest. Everything from the complexity of the supply chain all the way through to the distribution model, all the way through to, just learning about marketing. We're about to go live on a global ad campaign, which, we've never done before, because this is not what INEOS has had to do historically. But now we have to get out, we've got brand awareness to think about. We've got, we need people to know about the Grenadier, otherwise they're not going to buy it. So, but I think if I were to kind of answer your question directly, probably the biggest thing that's been quite interesting to understand is that sales model, right? So there's such a growing interest in automotive manufacturers like us selling direct to the consumer. So, and that was really, I guess, spearheaded by Tesla. They didn't want dealers. They didn't want to sell through a kind of more traditional franchise route. They wanted to sell direct to the customer. They wanted to own that relationship. They wanted to control the price. They wanted to own the data of everyone who was buying the cars. They didn't want a middleman. And they thought that it could be more profitable, I guess, as a result of that. And it kind of really sort of set off a bit of a snowball effect, really, of lots of automotive manufacturers thinking about doing the same. And that's been a really vexing thing for us, because, we initially said, actually, we would like to go down that route as well. And we are doing that in certain countries. But in the US, that's a really difficult thing to do because of dealer franchise law. So we're selling through dealers in a much more traditional way in the US. And actually just trying to get to grips with which model works the best, trying to get to grips with, maybe most importantly, which model customers like best. Are there models that work better for them? Because actually that's the more important thing. You're only going to make a success of this if people are buying cars and they're enjoying their purchase and they're enjoying the journey. So, and we're still kind of in the middle of really assessing that. I think lots of automotive manufacturers are. I think even the ones that have been around a very long time are struggling with that. So I think sales model route to market has been probably one of the more surprising things, because having brought lots of products to market in the past in a B2B way, I didn't think that would be a kind of challenging thing. I thought that would be the easy bit. But yeah, it's also going through a bit of flux in our industry at the moment.
Lynn, I was just wondering, so the engine is a BMW engine, and look, we're not car people. We love cars and trucks, and so it's a lot of fun for us. But we imagine that if you're BMW or some company like that, and you're trying to manage these mandates and what the world is telling you about what you're supposed to be doing, it's really nice. I'm just thinking out loud. If Grenadier comes along and says, we'd like to buy your internal combustion engine, so you're kind of creating a market that helps you plan your internal combustion engine, almost like Caterpillar continues to sell diesel, generators, et cetera. Like, do you notice as you deal with the automotive companies as your supplier for various things that they really appreciate and like the fact that you're doing this? This is exciting for them because it creates a longer term horizon for some of the components that they make. Is that, I'm kind of garbling that question, but you probably know.
Yeah, no, I've got the question. I mean, I think that sure, they all want to sell their products, right? So
yeah.
They're quite happy about that. I think many of them won't be reliant on us necessarily for combustion engine related components, because the other thing is these are all global companies, as are we. I mean, we're in 45 countries already, and we only started selling about 10 months ago. So, we're like those other component suppliers are only going to be banned from selling combustion engines in certain countries. And as I've already said, I'm not really even sure that, they're going to go to complete, electric net zero cars in the time frame they would like anyway, because there's not a playbook to get there. There's not a plan to build the sufficient infrastructure, to build out the electric grid, to even, build the renewable energy to make it net zero. In the UK, Germany, Poland, France, less so France, actually, they've got nuclear. But throughout large swathes of the world, fossil fuels will still very much be used to power these vehicles. So, I think that we're not necessarily, helping them kind of retain their business for a very long time single-handedly. They're kind of doing that themselves anyway, because they're selling into lots of countries. But what I would say is, it was pretty funny, I think, in the early days when we were calling up the likes of BMW and saying, we'd like to buy a straight 6-cylinder engine from you. I think that was, I wasn't around, I hadn't taken over by that point, but I think the sort of, sorry, who are you? Conversation must have been quite funny. But yeah, they're working together with us very well as a partner now.
So you mentioned selling in 45 countries, and I know as we've been talking about having you on the show and connecting with you, your travel schedule, I mean, you're all over. It's incredible how hard you're working and all these places you're going to. It just seems like it's a stunning feat to get legally, permitted to sell a car in that many countries. Like, how daunting was that?
I actually will take that stunning feat. I think it's a great way to put it, because I think we sometimes scratch our own heads and think, how did we do it? Every day for us right now is just, we're running at 150 miles an hour pretty much every day, trying to achieve what we're achieving. And it's really hard, right? It's really hard, not just for me, for my entire team. And when you actually sit back, as we did at the beginning of the year, looking back at last year and say, look how far we've come, it is a stunning feat. And I think that getting homologated legal cars on the road with all of the nuances of, a US car being different from a UK car, being different from a China car, being different from a South Korean car, being different from an Australian car, they've all got their little nuances, which means that every single vehicle that has come out of our factory to date has been unique in some form. And, when you layer on all the options that you can have as a consumer as well, as all the different country requirements. So yeah, it's it's an incredible feat. I think if I were to go back in time, I'd probably say, did we really need to launch in 45 countries in 1 year? Probably not. But we're there now, so
we'll do it.
We can reap the benefit now. But it was a busy year, and this year is proving to be no less.
So as you think about the sales, and you're in all those countries, and this is this is truly such a cool vehicle. You could see a lot of them, going to the US and Europe, but do you think a lot of them will go to, really rugged environments, Africa, Asia? Like where do you see of those couple 100,000 vehicles you might be making by 2030? Like where do you think they'll be going, or what's your sense of the markets?
So, what I can tell you today, based on our order book today, is that the US is our biggest market by a really long way, and we're just getting started there as well. Mm-hmm. So that's been, I think we expected that to an extent, but it's been a pleasant surprise, just how well it's been adopted in the US. So, and I think that yes is the short answer to your question. It will definitely be used in rugged environments. I've personally driven across parts of very rural Africa in, some crazy mountains, through rivers, and over salt pans and deserts. And I can sort of personally attest to the fact that we've tried really hard to brake the car. And, it really does go everywhere. So it will certainly be used in rugged environments. But what we're seeing is a pretty organic shift towards the lifestyle buyer as well. People like to just do cool stuff at the weekend and load it up, load up the back, load up the roof, and go and do cool stuff, whether it's, biking or, surfing, or, taking a motorbike, and getting into the middle of nowhere, towing boats. We're seeing a lot of that sort of happen organically, rather than just people that want to take it to extreme environments. And we think that will continue.
I was just thinking we'll include some pictures with this, but one of the just really cool feature is when you get in, it sort of feels like a cockpit, and then there are these switches, on the ceiling. I've seen some reviews where, whoever's sitting there can't help but start acting like they're a jet fighter pilot, and because it's just so cool. But that feature, the stuff on the ceiling, I maybe just talk about a couple of the features, including the little button that says toot, which is kind of fun. But maybe talk to us about some of the fun features.
Yeah, so we, again, just being very tactile, being a much more analog vehicle. And actually, we are seeing some vehicles go back towards this now. People started to get that real kind of fatigue, I think, with having to go through 5 different menus to open the glove compartment. There's a simplicity about getting in the Grenadier and just having a button for what you want to do. But we wanted to play with that and make it a little bit fun as well. So the overhead console, as you say, it's got all of the off-road controls in it. So your front, center, rear differential locks, off-road mode, downhill descent, ESC off modes, all the things that you're going to want to do when you're out in the middle of nowhere. And we've got buttons and switches, and it absolutely feels like you're a pilot, and you're either taking off in a helicopter or a fighter jet. Love that. So yeah, the probably the best feedback we get about the interior of the vehicle is that, because it's quite different. It's quite we're quite proud of that, and we'll definitely take that DNA into future models as well. The toot button was a bit of fun as well. We've got a normal horn in the middle of the steering wheel that you can kind of pump on if you're getting really frustrated at the driver in front of you. But we've always kind of thought that's a little bit aggressive. If you just want to very politely say, please get out of the way, I'm trying to get through, there's just a little bit of a less aggressive button that we've called the toot button. And we've put a bike on it because, it's maybe commonly used for cyclists. And many of us in INEOS are cyclists as well as drivers. And we obviously own the INEOS Grenadier cycling team. So, let's be polite to our cyclists. Having driven across Africa, as I alluded to or mentioned earlier, I would have put a goat on the Africa version. That would have been a really, really good version for Africa. But yeah, it's the polite, little bit fun toot button.
Well, and this is silly, but back to that public-private kind of thing. I feel like if you're in the boardroom of a public automotive company and someone said, we came up with a toot button. Well, first of all, the person would say, like, I'm career managing. I don't want to look silly. I'm afraid to say that. And then somebody with like a survey would say, oh, no, you know, and pretty soon you would kill the personality of the product. So I just feel like the toot button is almost representative of the good thinking you get when you're private. Maybe I'm getting carried away.
No, I don't think you are. I think that actually, as we grow, you know, and get much bigger as INEOS Automotive, we'll work really hard to hold on to that because it is such a great part of the DNA.
So one question for you, Lynn, on the you mentioned the governments and the attitudes and just, you know, everything you see that's in the policy discussion as it relates to emissions and such. But do you find that not only are governments realizing, hey, it's really hard to completely switch out the fleet and do all that kind of stuff, but that there also is some, I think what has bugged us sometimes is that, you know, we think electric vehicles are really cool consumer products, but they have their limits and they have their specialized uses, and they're not really decarbonization weapons. I mean, there's other ways to decarbonize, and we need to be a little more thinking more broadly and bigger picture here. Do you find that that people are starting to appreciate that EVs for the sole purpose of decarbonization, that we may have gotten, we may need to rethink how we're approaching those types of policies just on that basis? Or what do you think there?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been talking about this for a couple of years, this concept I was talking about earlier about multi-powertrain strategy. You know, there are different use cases for vehicles. Drivers have different needs, and not every vehicle or every use case works well for an EV. So we've been talking about that for a couple of years, and I'd say that it was kind of falling on deaf ears. We're kind of talking to ourselves most of the time. What I have noticed, particularly within 2024, is that I'd say that is changing. And I think it's because, as I mentioned earlier, I think in that legislation, the driver was left behind, and the driver is kind of voting with its feet now. You know, it's kind of saying, actually, you know, we've got through the first flush of people that wanted to buy one, and sales are falling off a cliff because the customer, the next level of customer, is saying either A, it's not for me, it doesn't work for my lifestyle, or B, I'm not sure yet. And I think that, you know, we need to recognize, as I said earlier, that there's going to need to be a great deal of different technologies to suit different outcomes. And I think that governments are starting to listen to that because drivers are voters.
I think you may have answered this question already, but I'll ask it. But Lynn, you know, for most of our guests on our show, we ask them, what do they think the energy world looks like in 10 years? I guess my question is, what do you think the automotive world looks like in 10 years? And what does INEOS Automotive look like in the next 10 years?
So I think automotive in 10 years will be, my prediction is that it will not be, 100% electric, even in the countries that are really, really pushing that and putting very tight deadlines on it, because I don't think, as I said, there's no playbook, there's no plan to actually get us there. A combustion engine in Europe and UK banned by 2035. If the only other option is electric vehicles, then it won't happen. I'd say that, a concern would be then that people just hold on to their vehicles for much longer. We become pretty uncompetitive in Europe because of it. That won't happen in the US for sure. It won't happen in the Far East for sure. But Europe has got itself into this very sort of ideological almost mindset. So I think the worst case scenario is that, it doesn't happen, we fail, and electric vehicles make up a proportion, but 30 plus a little bit, maybe some change percent, and the rest of the people are disaffected, left behind, and driving really inefficient cars for longer than they otherwise would have. I don't think that will happen. I think what will happen is sense will prevail, and there will be an acceptance by governments, drivers, less ideology and more of an understanding that transition will be required. And I think within that, there's probably an analog with the energy debate. Transition is really the key word. It's not something you can just flick a switch after hundreds of years of living this way. So let's transition in the best way we can and have a better chance of succeeding. And then I think you asked about automotive in 10 years' time. Well, I hope very much, and I'm putting everything into realizing that we'll be an OEM, an automotive manufacturer for many decades to come, with a fleet of vehicles. Off-road is our DNA. So when I talk about a fleet, it's going to be a lineup of various types of off-road, various types of wheelbase length, various types of powertrain, various types of capability. Some of them will get a bit more softer, a bit more lifestyle, a bit more urban, a bit more luxury probably, but others will stick with that kind of rugged roots. And yeah, that means that, our quality has to be really good. We have to really focus on our customer, and we have to be profitable, as you said earlier. So that's the plan.
Hey, Lynn, one more for me. How do you measure success, like for yourself, in this endeavor? Like, is it 5 years from now, we're selling hundreds of thousands of vehicles? Is it, we've established a certain kind of brand reputation and image? Is it, oh man, we've really helped influence sort of the direction of, automobile manufacturing and sort of returned it to some roots? Like, what's, I guess just outside of we want to be super profitable, like what are some signposts you're looking at to say, okay, this has achieved what we wanted it to achieve?
Yeah, and there's no quick answer to that, I don't think, because actually, all the things that you just said, and probably quite a few more, are what success is. And it really sort of talks to how complex and multifaceted this business is, and automotive in general is. And success therefore means, the customer first, right? Profit isn't first. Quality customer makes profit. You can't make profit without getting those two things right. So, and we can't exist without profit. So it's utterly circular. But, I don't want to make too fine a point on we're out for profit. We absolutely are. We want to make a business success of this, but we only do that if the customer is happy with the vehicle that we sell them. It's a vehicle that they want to buy. The quality is right. And then I think that, if we're successful at those three things, customer, quality, profit, then, the other things that you add on is I want a team that are super proud to work for INEOS. I want a brand that people globally recognize, and that when I'm out talking to people about what I do, they're no longer saying, oh, what's that? Or when I drive past in a Grenadier, they're no longer saying, oh, what's this? That we're just globally recognized. And then to your one of your other final points, if we've got a part to play as a complete fresh eyes newcomer into this industry in influencing how people think, and with maybe a little bit of a different aspect. We've talked a lot about our shared energy heritage today. INEOS brings something different to the table from other automotive manufacturers because it's got a purview of not only energy, but also things like hydrogen production, and how that might change the future of fueling our lifestyles. So I think if we can bring a little bit of that to bear as well, I will definitely see that as success. So unfortunately, that's a long list of KPIs, some of which I've probably forgotten, but we've got to kind of do all of it really to be successful.
Well, your comment there about INEOS's perspective as an energy and chemical producer and what that brings to its vision of where the world is going and how it's going to solve its problems, that's really fascinating. There's no other automotive or truck manufacturer that I can think of. Maybe Caterpillar has some of those aspects, but where they have that type of vision into the energy space that they can then translate a little bit into the mobility space.
Yeah, and it's it doesn't make things any easier for us in terms of building an automotive business. I can
Yes.
assure you of that, but it does
Yes.
allow us to see things from a completely different perspective, I think.
So one thing, Lynn, I think if you wouldn't mind, it comes up in our discussions quite often, which is that that it is hard to be a European industrial company. This just comes up, and mostly it comes up in the context of power costs or energy costs, and it frequently comes up around Germany, since it was such a huge manufacturing country, and it seems to be doing less, but it comes up across the continent. Any perspectives you would share as a European industrial company, and whether it's your power costs or your labor or your ability to quickly do things? We'd love that perspective, because I think we in the US are incredibly hopeful that European industry does well, because that's just good for everyone in the West.
So this is where I get the benefit of being incredibly frank as a private company. I think Europe is heading towards a death spiral, actually, if it doesn't stop and take stock of exactly the situation that you've just described. So for a great many years now, certainly more than a decade, the US has competed far, far better on, as you say, production costs, and that's energy, it's raw materials, it's had such a profound effect. And I'm really talking about shale, right? And the US becoming energy self-sufficient, becoming net exporter, that such a profound effect on its entire industry and its cost of living compared to Europe. And then you also then look east from here and see, such long-term thinking, not the same profitability drivers, not the same concern about the planet, quite frankly. I mean, I think there's lots of concern about the planet, but there's, the level of legislation in Europe, to the point that, it feels as though they don't want manufacturing anymore. Mm-hmm. It's a great thing. And, the UK puts out this chart every year, which says, here's our CO2 emissions over the last 20 years. Look how well we've done. Well, effectively, all you've done mainly is outsource manufacturing. And I think that if we are not careful in the center of this world, we've got the US to the west and China to the east. We're just going to be completely uncompetitive. And that's a real concern. I hope that there will be a recognition of that. I hope there will be an understanding of where that sits from a geopolitical perspective. But right now, we are really just concerned about legislating, predominantly for fairly ideological green ends, which as a planet, we all understand that we have to achieve. But you have to do it in the right way, and outsourcing everything is not the right way. That just makes you completely uncompetitive and completely unself-sufficient.
Is there a voice in Europe that is a real leading voice who is saying, what you just said, like, we have got to slow down, rethink, hit timeout, and think about is there a voice that you notice that's particularly resonating or is able to capture some of these arguments on behalf of the whole continent?
Not one that's loud enough.
Well, it is something that we think a lot about here. Let me throw in one last question while we have you, because it's another thing that I think in the big picture, everyone's trying to understand, which is China and electric vehicles and their strategy. I know it's a little bit unfair, because it's not what you do, but you bump into it more than we do. Do you think the Chinese EVs and their penetration of the global automotive market, like, that won't be competing with Grenadier, but how do you think about that as a force that could affect automotive companies, trade, regulations, adoptions of EVs or VVs? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge tidal wave hitting the market, which obviously, your president in the US has addressed very recently, with some very lofty import tariffs associated with Chinese EVs. And whilst those don't exist in Europe, I think there are at least some noises about that. I mean, obviously, China has had a very long-held strategy around this. It's a really heavily subsidized part of the market. They've kind of really worked hard on raw material sourcing and ownership and control on battery materials. So, they've got themselves into a really good position, and the technology has moved on so fast. When I look at sort of pre and post COVID in China, they used that time to just kick on so much technologically. So, these are not poor quality vehicles anymore. I think we might have looked in the past and said, oh, it's probably not going to be a very high quality vehicle. That's not really true anymore. I think the technology is good. The infotainment, the kind of human machine interface part of the vehicle is quite nice. People quite like it. They drive well. And, best of all, they're extremely cheap. So, I think that if I were a high volume electric vehicle producer, I'd be worried, and I'd be talking to governments really hard about what they're going to do to protect my business. Now, as you rightly said, I'm not going to be competing with that. So I can kind of look at it and, observe rather than have it as one of my long list of worries.
Yes.
But geopolitically, globally, it's a big concern, and that tidal wave is coming. And, they've done a good job with building those vehicles.
Well, you've been most generous with your time. As I mentioned, you're so busy. You guys are doing business in 45 countries. I mean, it's amazing everything that's going on. So we're honored to have you. We're going to tell our viewers, you have got to go see a Grenadier. It's very, very cool. So track down a local dealership. As we close, Lynn, anything we can do to help you, or what would you share as we wrap up on how our community could be supportive of such great entrepreneurial activity?
Just having me on your podcast, Maynard, big thanks to you and the team for giving me that platform. We're so extremely excited to be in the US and to have our vehicle there. As I say, we've got the Quartermaster pickup truck coming soon as well. And you'll start to see those on the road. We're relatively small truck probably compared to a normal size truck compared to some of the really big trucks in the US. But super excited that you had me on your podcast to talk about our business. Thank you so much.
Well, oil and gas country is pretty rugged. So I'm pretty sure, hopefully we'll see a tick up at the local dealers. Lynn, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.